Good morning, everyone. It is Thursday, January 25th. We are still the Ways and Means Committee. Today, we are going to dive back into the Who Pays report to really continue to understand the big picture of our tax structure here in Vermont, as well as how we compare to other states. And really glad to be joined by folks from the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. Then we are going to talk about, continue our work on modernizing our telecom tax structure. After lunch, we have a fairly massive series of witnesses on education finance. That's again, a joint hearing with two Senate committees and House Education Committee. And we are the hosts of that hearing. So please be back here after lunch promptly at 1:15. And then on the floor, we have budget adjustment today. So it is a delightfully full day here in the Ways and Means Committee. And really excited that we get to start it with you, Mr. Davis. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for the invite. This is great. So I will share my screen.
And if you could start off by introducing yourself, that's
Absolutely.
Thank you.
All right. So I'm Carl Davis, Research Director at the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, or ITEP. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan tax research organization. We do work at the state and federal levels. And in the last year or so, we added a local team as well. So we're ramping up that part of our work. But it's just great to be invited to talk to you guys about this. This report has dominated the last 2 years of my life. So it's just fun to be able to talk about what we've been up to. And also, my one regret is I wish I could be there in person. I actually lived in Vermont for a few years outside of Waterbury. Really love your state. I wish I could get back, but it's just not in the cards for my schedule this week. But anyway, I did listen to last week's hearing, so I'm not going to waste your time repeating a lot of information you've already heard. I'm going to try to build on the discussion instead. Just so we know what we're talking about, this is the Who Pays study. We've been doing some version of this since the mid-90s. So this is the 7th edition. So we've built up over this time, we've built up quite a lot of institutional knowledge and expertise on how to do this kind of tax modeling. I think we're pretty good at it, but I'm also biased. I'll concede that. This is the only comprehensive 50-state look at state and local tax distribution. You will find a handful of studies like this. Places like Minnesota and Texas do this kind of work using models and methods very similar to ours, and they reach conclusions very similar to ours as well. So there is a broad consensus among estimators on how things like the sales tax are distributed, or the property tax and the income tax. This research is largely in agreement on those key points. Excuse me. One difference between this edition of the study and the previous ones is that we are up to over 99% coverage of state and local tax collections. As Steph mentioned last week, it's an incredibly comprehensive look at all the tax dollars Vermont and other states are collecting. What is not in the study, and I wanted to expand on the discussion you started with Joyce last week, we do not have non-tax revenue in the study. And, you know, I think there are aspects of that could be revisited. I think there are certain aspects of non-tax revenue that could arguably roll into a study like this, thinking about things like toll roads and how those are so similar to gas taxes, potentially thinking about court fees and how some states choose to fund their courts more heavily with fees, others fund it more with general taxes. There are some areas of non-tax revenue that I think you could add into a broad snapshot like this. But I want to emphasize, I don't think that you should be viewing the omission of non-tax revenue as a particularly large or important blind spot. I put together one slide, and this is just census data on what non-tax revenue is, just so we're clear about what's not included in the study. So I have pie charts here for the US average at the state and local level, for Alaska, which is the most non-tax reliant state, and for Vermont. And there's some stuff here that you just wouldn't distribute across households, things like interest earnings. I mean, this is something that every state generates interest on, like the rainy day fund and that sort of thing. Alaska generates a lot of interest on invested oil wealth. So there's some things here that really that wouldn't be appropriate to include in this kind of analysis. I also, if you look at the green slice here, I think that's kind of an interesting example. That's solid waste collection. I live at the edge of a city where I have public trash service, but my neighbors a few blocks over are paying for private trash service. And my concern would be if we brought in non-tax revenue, well, you're going to be bringing in my payments to a public entity for trash service, but not my neighbor's payments. And so it's going to look like I'm paying a lot more than them. And I think you see a similar thing here with hospitals, with higher education. If we were to bring in all non-tax revenue, it could lead to it could make the data a little hard to interpret across states, because states that have more public hospitals or have more public schools or more public sewer service or more public trash service, they would look different just because those things happen to be publicly administered instead of privately. But it doesn't mean the bottom line impact on families' financial situation would be any different. So, that's just a word of I think it is, this is a study about taxes, but I wanted you to be aware of what's not in the study. And I think there's good reasons for excluding most of that. The other thing I know you were talking about quite a bit was the rankings and the index calculation. So I wanted to go into a little more detail on how that's done. This is a mathematical measurement of tax regressivity or progressivity. There's three components to it, the way we compile the index. The green line shows we're comparing tax impacts at the very top of the income scale to the very bottom. The blue line, we're comparing tax impacts at the very top to the broad middle. And then the purple line, we rounded out by looking at a broader slice of high income earners and a broader slice of lower income earners. That component is half weighted because there's a lot of overlap with the other two. And because that high income definition, lumping all the top 20% together, it's a little bit less informative than the finer grain cuts that we do, because the top 20% includes everyone from folks earning 136,000 to multiple millions of dollars a year. So it's a very broad group. I think an index like this, there's a lot of scenarios where an index, any reasonable index you put together is going to produce the same answer with these kind of like textbook distributional results. Any decent index is going to tell you both of these hypothetical tax systems, for example, are progressive systems. And it's also going to tell you the one on the right is more progressive than the one on the left. That's very straightforward. In the real world, though, we have it's not as straightforward as it is in the textbooks. So these are the top three most progressive systems. I know you talked about this last week, and I wanted to talk about why it is that Vermont is just behind the other two here. Really, the core issue is that Vermont has a narrower spread in tax rates from top to bottom than the other two states. So you're taxing your low-income earners slightly more than either Minnesota or DC. And you're taxing your high income earners slightly less than either of those two jurisdictions. So that spread is narrower, and that's hurting you on the summary statistic index ranking. And I want to be clear that finding, it's not a value judgment as to what your tax rates are, what your tax level or your revenue collection is. It's a measure of the distribution. And if you wanted to say leapfrog either of these two states and have a more progressive system than either of them, you could get there through tax increases or through tax cuts. You could do tax increases on high income earners to increase that spread and improve your progressivity rank. Or you could do tax cuts for low income earners. Those two things could have mathematically the same effect. So we're really measuring the distribution of taxes and how they vary across the income scale, not how heavily you're taxing people. I will say, though, I think the summary index measure is an incredibly useful thing for understanding the broad findings of the study at a glance. So like very clearly, Florida has a more regressive system than Kansas. Kansas has a more regressive system than Vermont, and so on. I think the index is a very clear-cut way to understand that. When you start looking at differences of one or two spots in the rankings, you're never going to get the full story from one index summary measure. It's no matter how you do the math, it's just not possible to convey all the nuance of the tax system in one summary measure. And so one thing I wanted to highlight here, all three of these systems, one thing they have in common is a little bit of regressivity from the middle of the scale to the top. All three of these states are taxing, or jurisdictions in DC's case, are taxing some middle or upper middle income earners at higher rates than the wealthy. And, by this measure, you're actually doing slightly better than DC. DC has a 1 percentage point spread between the 12.4% rate it's charging some upper middle class families and the 11.4% rate is charging at the top. You have the same issue there where but your spread is about a half percentage point. So by that aspect, in that aspect of the index, you're actually outperforming DC. But on net, when you look at the whole full system, the reason you still rank somewhat behind them is that the tails of the distribution. Your system isn't as progressive as theirs. So I think, you know, for you or for anyone else who holds progressivity as a goal, I think all three of these systems, these are the three most progressive in the country. None of these three is fully progressive through the full income scale. They all trail off a little bit at the top. So I think any of these three, if lawmakers are aiming for progressivity, there's still clearly room for reform and improvement there. And so what would that look like? This is my last slide. I want to leave time for Q&A, and I know you do have a busy day. But what could that look like? I think one interesting way of thinking about, you know, where could Vermont make progress on progressivity is to look at, well, what have other states done? And Minnesota is a really interesting example here, because if Minnesota had stood still since 2018 and hadn't touched its tax code, you would actually rank ahead of them today. What happened there is that they've enacted a substantial child tax credit, which I know you have as well, reformed itemized deductions, which I also know you've done. They've strengthened their corporate tax. But one thing that really stands out in Minnesota over the last few years, last year they became the first state with a broad-based personal income tax to begin taxing high-income earners' investment income, their capital gains and dividends, at a higher rate than salary and wage income. And, you know, that's actually the mirror image of what we see at the federal level or in Vermont, where capital gains income is somewhat preferenced relative to salary and wage income. Minnesota said, you know, we're aware of the federal preference. We think it's ill-advised or that's too large, and we're going to claw back some of that benefit and put a higher rate on capital gains and dividends. So they're the first state to do that, and that did affect where they rank. So that was one part of the package of reforms that left them with what is the most progressive system in the country now outside of DC. The other states here, Massachusetts is a very notable state. Of course, you all know voters approved a higher tax rate on millionaires just over a year ago. And the legislature followed that up with some increases in refundable tax credits at the bottom. Those two things taken together move the state 10 spots in our rankings. We ran, if you look at Appendix D, you can find these numbers. We ran for these states, we ran our calculations twice, once with these reforms in place and once with them not in place, so we could isolate the effects of those reforms. Massachusetts, before these reforms were enacted, was a pretty middle of the pack state with a pretty typically regressive tax system. Now it's among the 10 least regressive. It still does tilt a little regressive, but just barely so. New Mexico is moved more than any other state. They did very aggressive tax cutting for low income earners. The child tax credit and earned income credit and another low income credit they have, paired that with a sales tax cut. And then they also enacted a higher top income tax rate, and they have a capital gains preference that they pared back a little bit. So just like the other three states, they were cutting taxes at the bottom and increasing them at the top. So New Mexico is now also among the 10 least regressive states. That was a major move for them. And the last example you always have to talk about Washington. Washington, through every edition of the study since the mid-90s, has always been the most regressive state. They have high sales tax, high selective excise taxes. They have add-on gross receipts taxes. They rely very heavily on taxing what people buy to fund government. And lawmakers there, they've been unhappy with the level of regressivity in their system. And so they did a couple things over the last few years. They enacted a standalone earned income credit. They don't have a broad-based income tax, so they're going to administer it as a standalone rebate. So now they have an earned income credit, and they enacted a targeted tax just on high earners' capital gains with a large exemption. And those two things, they weren't enough to transform the system, but they were enough to move Washington just below Florida in the index rankings. So now when you see Florida as the most regressive system, it's not necessarily because Florida became more regressive. It's actually because Washington became less regressive. So that explains the flip-flop at the top there. So yeah, that's all my slides. I would love to take any questions anyone might have. And of course, if you haven't seen the report already, here are the web links to it.
Thank you. Questions for Mr. Davis? Yeah, Jim.
Good morning, sir. In past years, we've had testimony which led us to believe that Vermont's tax system overall was really quite progressive. And what you're presenting is different from that, and I wondered if you could comment on that.
So I'm not familiar with the exact testimony you're talking about. I mean, it could be, I think the income tax code is clearly very progressive. There's no question.
Okay, maybe that's it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and you net that together though with other regressive levies, and it ends up in a place where we judge it to be just barely progressive overall, but still you see regressivity present at certain points in the income scale. So we're calling these a hybrid system where you see progressivity through some parts of the scale and regressivity through others. It's hard to put one good word to a system like that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can you give me some idea of what another really progressive another country's scale would look like? I'm not sure what would be a really regressive but workable tax structure that another country might be using.
Yeah. You know, I wish I knew more about that. I think, as I said, we've just expanded into the local space. So I guess that leaves international as the next area where we could expand our research to. But it really hasn't been a research focus of ours. So I would really be speaking off the cuff if I were to comment on that. I don't want to lead anyone astray there.
Okay.
Representative Demmer.
Thank you. Two questions. First, on the pie charts that you had at the beginning, of the non-tax revenue, pieces, there was a big chunk of all of them that said other. And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about what that other is.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll pull that up again for you. Yeah, so this is the census groupings, and the other problem with trying to include non-tax revenue is that you're looking at so many little things. There's little fees here and little fees there. It's going to vary a lot by state. It would be a real difficult research and data challenge to try to compile these varied fees. So census just throws them all together in another category. I think if we were to go through the public use data with census, we could start to tease that out in a little more detail. But this was put together relatively quickly using their summary data, and they put a lot of stuff in the other camp because it's difficult to categorize. So that's really a grab bag of stuff here. There's a lot of variation across states, and I wish I could tell you more about that. And it is something I'd like to look more deeply into, but it hasn't been our focus as primarily doing tax research.
Got it. Okay. And just following up a little bit on Representative Maslin and Representative Taylor. So I also recall hearing, and I wasn't on Ways and Means until last year, but I recall hearing when I was in the legislature previously that Vermont's got a very progressive tax system, and I think that what we're hearing was that it was referring to the income tax, our income tax program. But I think what's really striking for me here is that it turns out that no states are really all that progressive. Where none of us are particularly progressive. It's all a matter of relativity. And there are states that are more progressive, states that are less progressive. But in the end, even the states that are more progressive, you look at that, you look at those bar graphs and you see it's flat. And that to me just doesn't really indicate all that much progressivity.
And it seems like we could do better.
Do better.
Learning from some other states. Yeah, Representative Odie.
Well, did you look at, well, you said you didn't look internationally, but, and I guess this doesn't take into account that states vie for business and for population with other states, and then nations with other nations, and then tax havens with nations. I guess that's kind of a statement, but what would you say that the reason for taxing is? What would you say that the goal of taxing is?
It's 9 times out of 10, it's to fund public services, to fund education and infrastructure and parks and all these other things. Taxes are also sometimes used to shape behavior, like in the case of a tobacco tax or a carbon tax. But typically the goal is to fund public services. And so, you know, we try to stay very neatly in the tax policy lane. And so that's a large part of the reason why when we constructed the index, we didn't want to come at it with value judgments about how much you're taxing, because that's not, you know, that's not something we can recommend to you. You know, what level of public services that your constituents want, or that your public, you know, or that you know, that your constituents want to see. That's really a political decision and a societal decision. So what we can mathematically measure is, well, for whatever level of taxes you are collecting, here's where they're falling and here's how they're impacting different families.
I wonder if you would add to one of the goals of taxation being to grow economies.
You know, in the sense, well, I guess in the sense that, like, if you don't, I would come at that from the perspective of, if you don't have robust, you know, public services, your economy really will struggle. If you don't have, you know, strong education systems or infrastructure networks that let businesses move goods efficiently. So the tax system is funding things that matter hugely to the economy. So I think that, you know, I think it absolutely, the way you levy your system, I think that's primarily the way in which it matters to the economy.
Well, primarily, what's the last thing you said?
I think that's primarily to the extent that taxes are funding these public services, they matter hugely to the economy. We see businesses all the time. For example, we often see chambers of commerce are among the most vocal proponents of gasoline tax increases, because they realize that those expansions of infrastructure can do a lot of good for their members, for their businesses.
So it's one of the goals is growing an economy would be part
Yeah.
of.
I mean, I could say that's a broader, you know, goal, a broader goal of government in general. And the tax policy is one contributing factor to that.
I think Representative Anthony had his hand up.
Yes.
And then, Brannigan, wow, sorry, Representative Brannigan and then Beck.
I thank you very much for your lending your expertise to us. I'm rather surprised in your array of answers to the why do we have it, it being a tax system. I thought the study or the comparison was not how much do you raise, but how do you raise it? And I would have thought that one of the answers, certainly to economic historians who have studied the contrast between the late 20th century and the 19th century, would have said, we learned a long time ago, capitalism has a tendency to concentrate wealth. And one of the ways you offset that and make life livable for most of the people is you redistribute income. And you don't simply tax people according to what government benefits they receive, unlike consumption taxes, for instance. So I'm surprised that has not come up in one of the purposes or the choice between progressive and regressive systems, even if you raise the same amount of money in each.
Yeah. No, I think and we definitely see a lot of the proposals at the federal level and in many states lately. I think that's a very fair point. They're being advanced with that policy goal in mind. I mean, I think it's just mathematically a regressive tax system is going to worsen inequality in the way it's collected, because you're taking folks with the least income and taking a larger share of their income through the tax code, and then you're doing the exact opposite at the high end of the scale. So a regressive tax will actually take this intense amount of inequality that we already have and compound it, whereas a progressive system will mitigate that inequality to a degree. You can't count on the tax system to eliminate inequality. That's not the goal. That's not going to happen. But a progressive system will tend to curb inequality.
I think I'm next, Mr. Davis. Good morning. We're happy to have you here with us this morning. So I wanted to let you know that in my experience about where this statement of Vermont having a very progressive tax system or the most progressive tax system in my experience, it comes from NCSL, the National Council of State Legislators. I like to go to their meetings, and I almost always go to their annual meeting. And there, it's often talked about that Vermont has this really great system, but I'm not sure that we do. But we seem to always make it onto the charts. The tricky thing about us living here in Vermont is that we're so small. We only have 640,000 people in the whole state, and a lot of them are retired. A lot of them are children. So our working population is not really that big, and yet we're struggling because we need to bring in some more money in order to provide the goods and services that these folks seem to want and need. Do you have any suggestions for us that would help at all? I see that we're within a few decimal points of matching these other folks in positions 1 and 2 on your 3-chart slide here. Any help you can give us?
I think if you're, I come at this, and again, maybe this is my personal bias because I fall into this group, but I think a focus on young families makes a lot of sense. Policies like the child tax credit, which I know Vermont has pursued recently, and you are not alone there. The child tax credit has been one of the most pronounced trends across the entire country in the last few years in the state tax policy space. So finding ways to make child care affordable, raising a family affordable, to provide good schools to those families, I know that matters a tremendous amount when families are choosing where to live, whether to stay in a state or move to a state. So I think focusing on, those are the things that are top of mind for if you're trying to get families to put down roots and stay. I think that's a worthwhile conversation to have.
Thank you.
Hey, Carl, this kind of feeding off of Representative Anthony's comment a little bit. I noticed I'm looking at slide 7 here of your slide deck, and to me, it looks like that these 4 states that you've identified that moved up, they have either added a progressive tax or credit or made an existing progressive tax or credit more progressive. And I'm wondering if there are any examples of states that actually got rid of a regressive tax, sales tax, for example, or something like that, or reduced sales tax in an attempt to make their overall more progressive.
Yeah. I think New Mexico is the only state that comes to mind that's done that. They have an extremely broad-based sales tax, and so they're very much of the broad-based low rate mentality. And so when they had a lot of revenue coming in from the energy sector. I believe it's the Permian Basin right there next to Texas. There's a lot of revenue there. And so that created room in their budget where they were able to reduce the sales tax, at least for the short to medium term. I know they're also very concerned there about the long-term trajectory of oil revenues, but that's what allowed them to do that. We haven't really seen sales tax or other excise tax cutting to a meaningful extent in other states. And I think the budgetary impact is a big part of the reason for that. It can be a pretty costly move to do percentage point reductions in those taxes. They raise a lot of revenue.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Together with my colleague, Representative Beck, I noticed the reverse of his kind of question. That is to say, what did people get rid of that was regressive? One of the things that got folks bonus points was capital gains reform. They departed from the federal rather low rate for long-term gains. And I'm wondering, I'm a little skeptical as to why or how you have rated that, because of course gains only show up and you're only liable for a one-off sale, as opposed to simply I buy, I never sell. And you may be very wealthy, but of course, because you've never sold, you're never subject to a gains tax. So I'm curious whether or not that's something potentially for us to explore, but also at the same time a little leery, because of the mobility of sellers of shares and so on. but whether or not that's really as important as you seem to have made it in your scale of added progressivity. It appears in 3 of the 4 movers of up 3 spots, 10 spots, 18 spots.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So in all 3 of these 4, these were taxes on realized capital gains. And so you can get very good data from the IRS on where those realized gains are flowing. And, in Washington states, Washington and Minnesota, actually, there's tremendously high exemption levels on both of those. So not only are they taxing an income source that tends to flow to high income people to begin with, but they also put high exemption levels on it. So if you happen to have a small amount of capital gains income, you're not paying anything at all under those tax expansions in those states. So these realized gains are undoubtedly progressive. Taxing them is undoubtedly progressive just because of the way that income is distributed. The other thing we do know from really just compelling reporting by ProPublica is that the wealthiest people, they report incomes that are just vanishingly small slivers of their total amount of wealth. And so there's a lot of unrealized gains and wealth accumulating that never shows up on a tax form. And I mean, it not just that it doesn't show up in any given year, it actually never shows up at all because of the stepped up basis provision, where if you have an asset that gains tremendously in value over decades of your life and you hold on to it until death and pass it on to your heirs, they inherit it with this stepped up basis, those capital gains vanish into thin air. So there's a lot of capital gains completely outside the system. So yeah, the realized gains we see are taxing that is undoubtedly progressive, but there is a lot that we can't see, and it's not in the IRS data that's not being taxed. And I think that is, if you're concerned with income and wealth inequality, that's very important to be aware of.
If I could, a follow-up, one of the types of tax on this theme of inherited wealth you did not mention is where states are in terms of having a different idea about inheritance. Massachusetts, I know, changed its recently. I'm not really very aware of other states. The federal exemption is pretty generous in any case. But you never mentioned inheritance taxes in your comparison.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that is that's another great point. That is another contributing factor. We do have those in the study using Survey of Consumer Finances data from the Federal Reserve, looking at wealth and melding that together with IRS data on the estate tax. Undoubtedly a very progressive tax. There is, I want to say it's about 17 states. Don't hold me to that number exactly, but I think it's 17-ish have an estate or inheritance tax of some kind at this point. One is pretty serious problem worth being aware of with the estate tax is that the tax planning industry has gotten exceptionally good at helping wealthy people avoid it over the last decade or so. I think the word loophole is a little bit overused. It is not. This is a clear-cut loophole where the tax planning industry was able to devise strategies that Congress never intended, and now people are skirting a very large share of the estate tax because of that. Problem in Vermont and other states is if you're coupled to federal estate tax rules, your tax base has been weakened as well due to Congress's inability to close these loopholes that never should have been there in the first place. So the estate tax is under threat and it's being eroded. And I think it is worth thinking creatively about what could be done to shore that up or to replace it with other levies on wealth that aren't quite as prone to this gaming that we're really seeing at a large scale in the current existing estate tax.
Thank you.
Representative Odie, and then we're going to go on to our next witness.
Here's one thing, I think, yeah, okay, inheritance taxes, and I think, okay, so some states, only 17 states have them, the rest don't have them. Federal government is generous. We don't exist in a vacuum, little Vermont. We have long borders, we have neighboring states with different tax policies. What happens? Have you looked at what happens when if everyone in the United States had this, all the states had the same policy? That'd be one thing. But when one state has different policies from another, then there's movement from state to state, or there's decision not to locate in specific states when the individual or the business would benefit from leaving a place, from not being in a place with higher tax. So whatever the individual or the business sees as negative might make them less likely to remain or to come to Vermont. So remain in or come to Vermont. So do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I think in the migration data, what we see with movement of people across state borders, actually most of the movement is lower and middle income people, oftentimes because they're seeking out a better job or they're seeking out cheaper housing, or a lot of times like me, moving for family reasons or maybe moving for climate. So I think we've actually seen the migration data show that high income people move at somewhat lower rates than other families. And so I think, and a lot of that is because they've already found economic success and they're comfortable, and they can, one of the great perks of being a higher income person is you have a lot more flexibility in choosing where you live. And so they choose where they live based on their preferences, not so much based on finances, because they're already doing better financially. So that is like the broad trend we see in the data. Absolutely. And no, there's no denying that some people have moved because of taxes. We've all heard the anecdotes. Those stories exist. But I think when you go deeper into the data from the IRS and census, I think those anecdotes tend to be more exceptions rather than, a canary in a coal mine of a mass migration. Actually, we see that the migration tends to be more, if you're concerned about population, it tends to be more moderate income folks seeking a better life, as opposed to high income people, moving for financial reasons.
And we can have witnesses who've sort of very specifically done research on this.
I would need that. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Davis. Really appreciate all of the work you do. We do hope to bring you back to Vermont at some point when you and your family are ready. And you're certainly spoken of very highly here. Thank you for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Hi, Steph. It's nice to see you again. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, thanks for inviting me. You ready for me to dive in?
Dive in, please. Thank you.
And is it best to share screen, or do you want?
We
do
love
have a
that if
slide
you don't
deck?
mind.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'll just say I also love hearing from ITEP because I always learn a lot from them too. So again, I'm Stephanie Yu, Executive Director of Public Assets Institute. Nice to be back again. I know I'm glad you had the chance to ask a lot of questions of ITEP since they know all the details of their methodology. So I just want to be quick and make a couple quick points about sort of what this all means, right? I think starting with this idea that a number of you have referenced, which is that the goal is a progressive tax system, right? And that we've heard, that what the ITEP work shows is that our system does improve income inequality, but I think as Rep. Devereaux said, and a couple others sort of referenced, that it's all relative, right? We have this reputation as being one of the most progressive states, and that's true, but that doesn't make us a sort of a robustly progressive system, and that there is still this regressivity at the top, and that no state has a truly progressive system. So I think the question is, and Carl alluded to this a little bit, what's the best way to make our system more progressive? Is it increasing taxes on the high end, decreasing them on the low end? And I think from my perspective, the answer is both. And I'll give you sort of our reasons why that's the case. So the first step is this eliminating the regressivity at the high end. Again, I think you all have now seen this chart any number of times. But again, a Vermonter making $90,000 or $140,000 a year should not be paying a greater share of their income than somebody making $500,000 or $1 million a year, which is what's happening. That's what ITEP's work makes very clear, that's currently the case. So I think we want to make sure that the overall system looks more like the income tax chart, and it actually is sort of this clean progressive system rather than this kind of bumpy, uneven version that we've had over the years. And again, I think the best way to do that is to focus on taxing on bringing up those rates on the high end, on taxing those higher income Vermonters. And in fact, I think that's the best way to ensure that we can maintain a progressive system for everyone, that those at the top are contributing according to their ability to pay. Otherwise, I would say it's fair to say that those paying more, essentially the middle class, are subsidizing those highest income Vermonters. And I also want to kind of bring up something that that we kind of touched on briefly last week, but kind of dig into a little bit more, which is that we've really been focusing on the state tax systems. This report is great. It's a look at, comprehensive look across all 50 states and DC, but really, the federal income tax. I want to talk about the federal system for a minute, because the federal income tax is still very progressive. And it's what our income tax has been based on. We used to piggyback, even once we stopped piggybacking, a lot of those state progressive income tax models are sort of based on, similar bracket structure, similar kind of breakdown of where those rates jump up. In some states, the higher rates kick in a little lower, or they're flat. But so the federal income tax is still a progressive tax, but I think we all remember the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2018, which really disproportionately benefited higher income taxpayers. Again, ITEP has also done a lot of great work on this, and recently showed that if the provisions in TCJA are extended, again, a lot of the big provisions are set to expire in 2025, although there's a lot happening at the federal level about what will happen with a lot of those different pieces. But if the TCJA provisions are extended into 2026, what ITEP was showing was that the top 1% of Vermonters would see about $80 million in tax cuts, or about $24,000 per taxpayer in that top 1%, right? And I didn't have time to make the latest chart, but this is the chart from 2018, and really the shape is the same of what the TCJA did across the income distribution. So really concentrated at the top, those tax breaks went to the richest 1%. And I think it's just kind of worth reminding ourselves that act has been in place since 2018. So every year since then, the top 1% has been benefiting from those tax breaks, right? And that goes through 2025. And I also think, on top of that, that's sort of a compounding of what had been the trend for the 40 years before that, right? The Bush tax cuts, the Reagan tax policy, all sort of meant that benefits were accruing to the top. I think the federal income tax system has been very progressive at times and gotten less progressive over the last 40 years. It's still progressive, but I think it's worth noting, that these tax breaks have really been accruing to the top. So I think it's pretty fair to say that there's still plenty of taxing capacity in Vermont. We're talking about $80 to $100 million in tax breaks every year over the last, 6 years now. So I just wanted to kind of note that as sort of, we've been focused on the state tax system, but sort of putting it in this broader context. And I think it gets to this tax migration question too, because I think, we sometimes forget that in the picture of an individual family's or an individual person's, tax picture, the state piece is a small piece relative to the federal piece, right? The federal piece is sort of the big dog still, and all of that. And I think that speaks to part of why you don't see this tax migration from state to state, because it's really a small slice of what's going on in a person's tax situation and their finances, how that state matters. And to Carl's point too, I think there is tons of research that shows that higher income people are less likely to move, partly because oftentimes their higher income, their success, their business is rooted in a place, right? They have the relationships, they might have built a business there, whatever it looks like, they're less likely to leave. So I think I think all of these things sort of just give a little context to the conversation around the state tax system and what's possible and how it affects or doesn't affect people's behavior. But I also want to kind of take a minute and make a case on the lower income end of the scale. Again, I think we should be proud of where we are in this state, that we're one of the least progressive states, even slightly progressive, and that we've been getting more progressive, right? Again, largely due to increases in the EITC, dependent care credit, and then that implementation of the state child tax credits. And we use these refundable credits to return money through the income tax system to lower income Vermonters, which is why on that personal income tax chart, you see that at the low end, it's negative, right? Like there's a returning of money, and that's not true in a lot of states, right? But in the most progressive states, you do see this negative or slightly negative, and Vermont has gotten more negative. Again, I think, and Carl can correct me if he needs to, but you know, it's not totally apples to apples because they have changed their methodology quite a bit since 2018. But you know, I think sort of those adjustments are pretty robust and pretty clear. So while on the personal income tax chart, the lowest 20% show up as negative, and we see, you know, it's gotten even more progressive through that sort of bottom 40%. It's still not enough. Vermont, again, I think Vermont has a couple of tools that are really useful that not all states have. And one of those is the basic needs budget, which, as you know, comes out every 2 years. And I know there's been a lot of recent work last fall on whether and how to tweak the methodology of that report. But again, at its core, I think it's a helpful tool that not many states have, and that we could really be using it to have a better sense of how families are doing and to help measure how far we have to go to make sure that all Vermonters can meet their basic needs. Oftentimes, when we're talking about tax credits and benefit programs, we're really focused on the poverty level as a way of establishing eligibility. And even when we go up to 185% of poverty or further, you know, we're really sort of anchoring it in that poverty number. But I think, you know, I think Vermont's done a lot as a state to sort of recognize that that threshold is way too low and really understates which families are struggling to make ends meet. And I think that's where the basic needs budget can be really helpful. Again, I think we can tweak the methodology. We can sort of argue about, you know, how finely to kind of dig into housing costs between the Northeast Kingdom and Chittenden County, or, you know, and we do have some of those sort of regional differences. We can talk about that, but it's not going to change the underlying reality, which is that there's a really huge gap between what we call poverty and what families really need to make ends meet, what it really takes to support a family of any size. So I want to show you just a couple quick couple charts more quickly.
Yeah, sorry, one question from over here.
And maybe this is not going in the right direction at all, but do you have a W-2, a pure W-2 chart where you see just what W-2 income is in the state of Vermont and just so?
I don't have
it's not even apples to apples when you look from the 150 to the 30,000, because
right.
In that 30,000, you've got maybe somebody owns a business, has deductions and depreciation. And so what if we looked only W-2 income? What would just W-2 income look like in Vermont? Period. That's it.
So I don't have the chart in front of me, but I can tell you that the income stats do, you know, the income tax stats, both from the tax department and the IRS, do look at this. And so you can really split out what salary and wage income across the different thresholds. And you definitely see and we've actually been working on kind of a more detailed chart of how the income, what are the income streams that come in at the different income levels. And so I'll say a couple of things. So you do see certainly middle class, lower income, a lot more of their income is salary and wage as you start to get higher. And I think you're right to ask the question of sort of where is that threshold where capital gains or dividend and interest income really start being more of a family's income than kind of salary and wage? At what point are you is it less about earned income, less about what you're earning from your job, and more about sort of living on wealth that you have accrued somehow, right? And I think it's a really good question. We know it's true at the top, but sort of where that line splits is not totally clear, and something we're trying to dig into. I will say that it's also at the lower end, you also see their salary and wage income, but then if you're depending on how it's reported, you're looking at things like reach up or like income that's coming in from other, cash that's coming in from other sources. So those also get into the mix at the lower end. But if you're looking at you can look at just pure salary and wage income across those income tax stats. And you definitely see that, below a certain point, salary and wage income is pretty much the income for families. That's pretty close to 100% of their income. And then as you get really high up, you see that really kind of break down. but we'd have to dig a little deeper to kind of give you the exact point at which there's sort of that shift. I don't know if it's something that you can pinpoint or if it sort of varies once you get up to the high end of things. So I hope
Steph,
that's
I'm
helpful.
realizing we haven't had public assets in this year to talk about the State of Working Vermont report, and we usually do that. But I think Carol has another question.
Then the more you spoke, the more I thought, I have another question. So the W-2 separation, and that is it's this taxing wealth. But the thing is, I'm thinking if you've worked your whole life and now you're retired and now you're going to live off what you saved, you could call that wealth. So tell me, how do you separate living off of what you saved as a retiree? How are you going to separate that versus something that you're talking about that's in, a different kind of thing that you're talking about, over $10 million, whatever?
So I think that's a good question. And I think that is part of, like, when you look at the Who Pays report, they're excluding taxpayers over 65. And I think that's a big part of the reason why is because a lot of state tax codes and the federal tax code have a lot of preferential treatment for retirement income, right? Social Security income is certainly something that's been on the table in Vermont, how much to kind of exempt and what that should look like. And so there is kind of a very different picture once you're talking about retirement income, but there's also a lot of preferential tax treatment, both how you save the money in the first place and sort of how the distributions happen. So I think it's definitely possible to kind of separate that out and understand who's a retiree living on an income versus what Carl might be referencing, which is that people with lots of wealth can kind of show relatively low incomes versus what you want to know, which is who's, sort of genuinely a retiree living on Social Security, fixed income, who has a slightly different picture and less ability to kind of earn additional money than somebody else. So I think there are ways to do that. It's not something I can put in front of you, but there's definitely distinctions made in terms of retirement income from salary and wage income. We also know, of course, in Vermont, we skew older, right? So our workforce skews older. More over 65s are still working. There's been some discussion around the fact that the EITC only applies to people under 65 for people without children. So I think, there's still plenty to dig into there, but it is definitely possible to separate out retirement income from other types of income.
I want to make sure that Steph has the time she needs to finish her presentation. We have time to hear from Joyce. Steph, do you want to go through all 17 of those slides, or do you have a full deck that you're picking and choosing from? I just want to get a sense of what your time is.
I only have 6. I only have one more. The 17,
Okay.
I always have hidden ones in case you ask questions that I might.
I know, I love that you do
another
that, but it also
but
makes it harder
I
for me
only
to
have
judge
one
how much time you need. So back to
Totally.
you just for a moment. And then I think Representative Demeraux has a comment.
Sure. So the last one that I'll show is a preview, and I appreciate you kind of referring to State of Working Vermont. It's actually quite late this year for a lot of different reasons, part of which is because we wanted to be able to use ITEP's data, which came out in January. But I'm about to show you a sneak preview of one of the charts that's going to go in there that we've been working on for State of Working, and our hope is that it's out in the next week. We're getting close. But this is something that we try to do most years, but definitely when the basic needs budget comes out every 2 years, we sort of look at what's going on, and by family type, what share of families aren't able to meet their basic needs. And so this obviously isn't every family type, but this is sort of a lot of the most common family types that we see. And this really tells us how far families are from that basic needs threshold. We always report on the poverty rates. Recently, we've been reporting on the supplemental poverty measure because that does take into account things like the COVID aid and the additional federal aid. But this is about the basic needs number. So I just kind of want to point out, probably not surprising, a lot of single parents are struggling to make ends meet. Between 21 and 22 versus 18 and 19, most families were doing better. And again, I think that's largely credited to the federal aid. This is self-reported income, right, against the basic needs threshold, reported income in the microdata of the census. And then, so you see most of these groups did better in 21, 22 because of a lot of that federal aid. Again, not surprising that single parents struggle the most. You know, one earner with dependents is going to be tough. But I always like to point out, like, what's striking to me is that even two earners with two children, a third of them are far from meeting their basic needs. A third of them are falling short of their basic needs. And I think it's also worth just pointing out here too, that single category, right? That single category is often one that, you know, as much as, you know, I certainly agree that there's a lot of need to support families, that the child tax credit's important and the EITC as well. But half of single folks in Vermont are not able to meet their basic needs. So that's pretty striking too. So, you know, just really kind of looking at both kind of the low end and the high end of how to make this more progressive. And I think that's sort of the path forward from my perspective.
Thank you very much, Carl.
Thanks, Steph. Question about, and I don't want to beat the tax migration horse to death, but I wanted to ask you a question, sort of the inverse of Representative Odes. And maybe this is a question for Carl, maybe it's for you, Steph, I'm not sure.
Joyce actually did a big migration study this summer too.
Oh, okay.
So,
But the question is, for states that are more progressive, have they seen benefits on the workforce sort of inflow issue? And I know we've got a housing issue here too, but I'm just wondering if there is any benefit on a workforce inflow standpoint for a more aggressive state.
Yeah, so it's a fair question.
More progressive state, not regressive.
Sure. So we also did some migration work last summer and looked at, and that covered, I believe it covered 21. So it was sort of the early pandemic stage of what was going on. And we really saw, and what we saw there was that, and I think JFO also replicated that when they were working on the migration stuff, is that actually we saw more high income younger people, right? Sort of middle, I want to say it was the 35 to 44 range, or sort of in that range, definitely under 45, young families, higher income, moving to Vermont. Again, I don't like to get too caught up in sort of 1 year to the next kind of migration stuff, but look at it sort of over a longer period of time in the big picture, because in any given year, you know, there's ebbs and flows. I would say in general, though, I think that the focus has been more on these states haven't lost people, right? I don't know that you can claim that there's any direct gain, but these states haven't lost people when the tax system has gotten more progressive. They haven't lost high income earners on net. Again, you might have these anecdotal examples, but on net, you're seeing improvements, and it's really not what's driving people's decisions one way or the other. Again, more job opportunities, family, all of those things are much bigger drivers than any changes in the tax code.
Thanks.
Thank you. Peter, you got the last word.
Okay, thank you. Stephanie, one of the things that a presentation a couple of days ago from Representative Harrison reminded me, some states actually have managed to integrate an incentive, a benefit from permanence of residency, which of course means then you file in our state for income and various other things. Link that to the reduction of some regressive tax. Let me pause and see if that's processable. We have a series. We have a series of regressive taxes, and as the preceding presenter said, you can become more progressive by removing some of the regressivity or some of the bite of a regressive tax, instead of always thinking about how do we make the existing tax more progressive. Just remove some of the regressivity. One of the ways to do that is figure out how you would tailor that to the difference between casual visitors and permanent residents. And permanent residents are really important for self-government and, as Harrison showed up, emergency personnel.
So I'm not familiar with the sort of exact presentation you're talking about. I know that there are some, there are some considerations against sort of taxing out-of-state people more than others. I think there's restrictions on what's possible. I definitely think that you can get at that, and there's probably ways to get at some of that stuff more indirectly. We do kind of look at, there's some work, but it's harder to measure sort of what share of taxes are exported. In other words, paid by people that aren't residents of the state, and there's different ways to do that. But, again, I think I come back to kind of the theme that Carl might have mentioned and that I've talked about before, which is I think it's the if you build it, they will come kind of idea, which is, right, you build the state that you want to live in, and the permanent residents will want to stay and thrive, and people will come. And I also sort of hesitate about this idea of, thinking of our state as competing for people, as opposed to thinking of how to make the best state that we can, both for the people that live here now and for anybody who lives here in the future. So that's sort of more how I would think about it. But, I'm happy to, I'm happy to go back and look at the presentation and see if there's anything specific that, I might, we might look at or think about differently.
Thank you. We're gonna go. Thank you very much, staff. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, George.
Good morning again, everyone. I'm Joyce Manchester with the Joint Fiscal Office, and I just want to give a shout out to Carl. It's great to see you, great to hear you. And yes, you have to come back to Vermont soon. So I've been taking a few notes, and my public finance antenna have been quivering. So I have a few things to talk to you about. First off, yes, it is absolutely true that Vermont is known as a highly progressive state because of its income tax structure. And also we get points because of our education tax or property tax structure that bases taxation on income for the 70% of the population, right? So that's because of our progressive income tax, that's going to be a progressive slope to the property tax until you get to the top 30%, where you're looking at the value of property. And that tends to be somewhat regressive because people don't continue to spend a same proportion of their income on property as they become higher income. So I think that's the genesis of Vermont being a highly progressive state. And it's always useful to look at the whole picture together. So thanks to ITEP for doing that study. There's been a lot of talk about what I see as the political economy of tax policy. And that's where you think about not only the economics of tax policy, what's the distribution, how are you raising taxes to pay for public services and so forth, but you also think about the effect on people's behavior. And this is where we're going to hear from experts in the future on behavioral responses to tax policy. But in my demographic, you certainly hear about the people who live in Vermont for less than 6 months and a day, so that they're not Vermont residents, right? So that's a behavioral response to tax policy, and that needs to be considered. Maybe we touched on this when we were looking at high wealth folks earlier this week, but in Vermont, the tax returns that show more than $1 million in income are responsible for 20% of the net income tax revenue in the state. And that comes from 1,050 approximately tax returns. So you just want to be aware that it's a relatively small number of people who are paying 20% of the taxes. And for folks, for tax returns with 500,000 or more, they pay 30% of the Vermont net income tax revenue. So you just want to be careful.
Just want to let her finish your sentence.
Oh.
No, perfect.
So would you add the 30 and 20, or would you say part of the 30 is in?
Look, all the people above 500,000 and above, they pay 30%. Yes, absolutely. Yes, thanks for qualifying. And the one footnote that you want to think about maybe is what percentage of those people are 65 plus, meaning they're more likely to be retired, more likely to perhaps be mobile, although the comeback is, well, workers could be more mobile these days, given remote work and so forth. So I'm not sure how that shakes out.
I'm sorry, Madam.
Nothing to be sorry
Chair, that went by me so fast. I mean,
Yes,
just starting to sink in the significance of what you just said. And I want to make sure I got these figures right. You're talking about 1,150 people.
1,050 people have $1 million in income on their tax returns. Yes,
And those are the people who bring in,
20%. Millionaires are responsible for 20% of net tax revenue.
and when we add them to the folks who have 500,000 or greater in income, that's 30% of our tax run.
From personal income taxes.
Wow.
Yes. It's
That's much
very
higher
high.
than I thought.
Yes, and that's straight from the Department of Tax tables on the web.
Is that in our fiscal facts book? Or?
I don't know. It's on a presentation that I didn't have time to give on Tuesday. So we can look at that a different day if.
Yeah, send me the slides.
The
Sorry.
slides are actually posted on today.
Oh, are they both? Not,
You
okay.
just gave us a number of millionaires. What's the number at 500?
Yeah, I'd have to look at the presentation.
I will.
It's there.
Thank you.
Something like that?
Odie.
So then, all of a sudden you said 65 plus. People who are 65 plus, in that $1 million or more, 500,000 or more, do you have a breakdown of what the ages are in those two things?
So the tax department shows us 65 plus separately from all tax returns. And what I recall is that about a third of the millionaire tax returns are 65 plus.
And are those W-2?
That's AGI, so adjusted gross income.
So are they actually working, or do we know whether people are working? Because what I'm thinking about is a slide I saw, can't get this out of my head, eight years ago when I first started. And it was this slide of where we get our income tax revenue in the state. And it showed the age group that was earning the most. And it was like, let's say 45 and up. And then I think we saw a slide yesterday that showed it was like 55 and up and 65 and up.
Okay.
So I'm wondering, I thought,
Okay.
okay, my gosh, when that bubble goes through,
Yes, absolutely.
the people behind that bubble, are they ever going to make the money that the people in that bubble now are making? Because if they're not, we're not on general fund.
It's okay being a member of Gen X, Carol. I'm like in it every day.
goes.
Joyce, I'm so sorry you never finished your presentation and people are asking us about your presentation. And that's on me, so.
No, that's fine. I can say that generally speaking, wages peak at 45 to 54. Generally speaking, right? Because you're moving through your career, and the folks who are 55 plus, some of those folks are retiring, right? So, right. So the peak in wages in what you're earning occurs at the 45 to 54. The peak in wealth, which may be what you have in your mind for being 65 to 74, the peak in wealth occurs slightly after the working year. 65 to 74 is when we see, on average, the peak in household wealth or family wealth.
And that is in the presentation.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so well, it's in my mind. I think it takes a while to process everything. So when you say wealth for the 65 to 74, what do you mean?
So wealth means assets. So financial assets and non-financial assets, what belongs to you, minus any debts that are owed by the household.
Yeah, I got that part, but I guess
And speaking to your retirement wealth question, the Survey of Consumer Finances, which shows that peak at 65 to 74, includes the value of defined benefit retirement assets, which is not always easy to see for households because of course you don't have a lump sum behind a defined benefit plan that's going to pay you so much per month as long as you live, right? But the folks at the Federal Reserve Board do a good job of attributing that defined benefit wealth to households. So that accounts for a big chunk of wealth above 65, of course, especially for middle income folks.
Representative Brennan.
That chunk of wealth for the folks above 65. So you said that's their assets, so that would be their house and property, which they've already paid tax on and continue to every year.
Mhm.
It's money in the bank,
Mhm.
that's had income tax.
On interest.
Some of it anyway. I
Yeah.
think that the deferred comp might be the one exception to that.
Mhm.
Compensation would be money they set aside. So I'm not really entirely clear how that works, but I don't think they paid tax on that asset.
I think that's right. I think they would pay tax on the deferred comp payments. So when they receive payments from their deferred comp account, they would have to pay tax on it.
So is that, when folks turn 72, there's some chunk of money from the government they have to start?
Yes,
Or, it's a federal rule.
yes.
Is that deferred comp? Or is that something else?
Yes, that's including deferred comp, but the big chunk is coming from 401ks and other kinds of retirement assets that the government says you need to start spending down. And as you start spending them down, you're paying taxes on them. If you didn't pay going in, right? So there are some Roth IRAs or Roth accounts that you've paid tax on, and those you can withdraw, no taxes
And no-
additionally paid. But most retirement assets are in what they call pre-tax accounts. So you didn't pay tax on the way in, and you pay tax when you withdraw them.
So what they owe, what the state still has coming then for tax, if you want to think of it that way, would be tax money we can collect on the assets that they have not paid tax on before. And if they've paid tax on it, then they've paid tax on it already and they're done.
Yes, the one exception that Carl was talking about is wealth that's going to roll over to the next generation. And when it rolls over to the next generation, there's what's called a step up in basis, so that there are never any capital gains paid on that change in wealth.
I think a lot of my farmers do that,
Absolutely, very common. Yes,
but it's farmland.
yes.
So it's not money, it's farmland. That,
Well, it has a value, and the value is going to the next generation.
yeah,
So if we were to tax the unrealized gain before it's paid out, right, before you sell the land, you would be paying tax all along the way. But if it remains in the value of the land that's not sold, it just transfers to the next generation, then the value of that land is stepped up. It goes to the new market value so that the new owner, if he or she sells the land, would only pay that new difference. So from the time he or she inherited the property to the time they sold it, that's the increase in value that they would pay capital gains tax on.
And I think Representative Brennigan, your sort of like list of sources of wealth, the big category you left out is like investment holdings that are not in retirement accounts. And certainly, I don't know if, I think most people in this body and most people in America don't necessarily have significant wealth in that form, but many, that's where the majority of wealth in America is held, right? And so that's sort of what's left off the list. Your average person might have a home and might have a retirement account, but might not have sort of that non-retirement account. So
do we have a way of finding out how many of our 640,000 people have that?
that is no, but that's part of what Joyce is trying to get at in the presentation we didn't finish last week that we will maybe get back to. Yeah. Representative Bodie.
This is a raising revenue question, but is there a way for the state to offer a chance for people to pre-pay taxes on something in a year? Like, let's say people decided the state said, well, we're gonna give you the chance to prepay your taxes on your IRAs and turn them into Roth IRAs. And we'll somehow incentivize that. Would that be able to be a way for then people to be able to later on have in retirement, have tax-free Roth IRA, and would also be a way to raise revenue in a year, particular year or 2 years, or whatever, for the state?
So I'm not the legal expert and I don't know the rules on transferring pre-tax into post-tax retirement accounts. I know while you're working, you certainly have the choice of,
And we can have someone else to be able to answer that question.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, and you, yeah. Other countries. So many other countries use what's known as a value-added tax, a VAT, which is a consumption tax, right? And consumption taxes are known to be regressive because people with lower incomes spend a higher share of, they spend all their income on consumption, right? So it tends to fall as a bigger share of their income on lower income people. But a VAT is very hard to evade, right? Because you have to buy goods and services and the VAT is levied on goods and services. So it's considered to be a very efficient tax, meaning that you levy the tax, you're going to get the revenue because people have to buy the stuff, so they're going to pay the tax, but it is regressive. So when you look at European countries, many of them have a big reliance on VATs, and therefore their tax systems tend to be more regressive than you might think otherwise, right? They could have a progressive income tax system, but a heavy reliance on VAT, which turns that system more regressive.
For those people who are not so familiar with the European tradition, it's also, of course, does not discriminate between goods and services.
That's right. It's
So it falls on labor,
Yeah.
essentially.
Yep.
And
Yep.
high labor activities are part of the tertiary sector, which is taxed
Mhm.
heavily.
Mhm. Yep. But it's a different mindset, and the US is the only one of the major developed countries without a VAT because it is such a workhorse of the tax system in most of the world.
So then I gotta ask, what, is there a country that is considered the most progressive according to the
So,
actual depth to what the definition we're using?
so this could be a long presentation.
Well,
You
I
want to
think we
stop
wait
at some
for that.
point?
I'm gonna stop in like 4 minutes.
Okay, let me just say a few words about the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient is a way to measure inequality across an economy, across a population. And a Gini coefficient of 0 means that everybody has exactly the same income or the same resources available to provide for themselves. Okay, and that doesn't exist. That's a theoretical 0, right? And a 1 would mean that one person or one household has all the resources and nobody has anything else. Okay. So the US, according to CBO,
The Congressional Budget Office?
Congressional Budget Office, yes, thank you. The Gini coefficient for the US in 2020 was 0.417. Okay, so 0.417, and that is after taxes and transfers. And I think whenever we have a discussion about the basic needs budget, we have to remember that the basic needs budget assumes that the households have no access to publicly provided programs. They do not have access to Medicaid. They do not have access to Reach Up or housing subsidies or whatever. We at the Joint Fiscal Office are saying, what's the cost to a household of providing housing and food and everyday living expenses without relying on government help? Okay, so a big difference between what do families need to live in Vermont and what does the basic needs budget say is that a low-income family in Vermont has access to many of those public services, not included in the basic needs budget. Okay, so anyway, so I'm back to my Gini coefficient. Okay, so before taxes and transfers, the Gini coefficient for the US is 0.533, meaning that the tax system overall is redistributing income from higher income people to lower income people, right? Because we're going down towards where we want to be, down to 0.41. The Gini coefficient for Sweden, which is often cited as a more progressive society overall, Gini coefficient for them is 0.333. Okay, so it's another notch down towards more even distribution of after tax, after transfer resources. That's a lot. That's a lot to take in, I know. On my list, I have 30 seconds.
You can have a whole minute if you
A
want.
whole minute, okay, I have.
You could come back every day if you want to.
Okay, oh, we've covered a good bunch of this stuff. Oh, yeah, we have. This is great. This is great. I had on my list behavioral responses to taxes before versus after taxes and transfers, the millionaires, the 500,000 folks, the basic needs budget. Oh, I did want to say the basic needs budget or something equivalent is available for every state. It's calculated by MIT. I can get you the reference for that website, but it is a consistent methodology that is performed for every state in the country. And you can see what their basic cost of living would be across the 50 states. And I think a possibility for Vermont would be to go to their methodology, and it makes it much more comparable to look at Vermont's basic needs, cost of living relative to other states. But I know that some people feel strongly that there are reasons why Vermont needs to do it for itself and should not rely on somebody outside the state performing that calculation. So that's a discussion for you all. But it is available if you want to do some comparisons.
Is it this set of slides entitled background information about wealth?
There's a lot of information there about wealth and its composition and where it's coming from and whether higher income people are getting a bigger percentage of their wealth from different sources. That's there. But if you want to look at the tax contribution by higher income people, then go to this other presentation, which should also be on the website, which talks about higher income. Yes, 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 yes.
Got it.
Yes,
It was on for Tuesday.
yes, yes, we didn't get to.
We will get back to it, I promise.
How similar is the Vermont current day basic needs budget to the MIT basic?
Let's talk about the basic needs budget in depth another day, but I appreciate your question.
But there is an appendix, I believe, in the basic needs budget report that goes to that issue.
Thank you very much.
And Pat did that report? So basic needs?
Basic needs budget, yeah, I think Pat took it over this year.
Yes, yeah,
Dickerson used to do it.
yes, yeah. Yeah, it's a good report. It's somewhere inside the reports. Representative Anthony.
Since it has arisen to talk about goods and services provided in it as part of the mix of progressivity to certain income classes, I have to ask, do we know by income class what benefit befalls residents as a result of tax expenditures in Vermont?
Excellent question. Excellent question. I wish we had the answer. And if we had all the resources in the world at JFO, we would do that study.
Yeah.
It would be tough to do.
I know. yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, but very
Just
interesting.
even rough indication would help me think about that when we have to keep deciding about it.
Yes, and of course, Pat does the annual tax expenditures report that sort of lists the tax expenditures, and you can go down the list and
Right.
think about who's
Just don't know who's behind it.
Well, you don't always know. Sometimes you can have an inclination. Yeah.
Thank you.
Are we good?
Everyone.
Thanks
Thank you, Joyce.
We're gonna take a 3-minute break and be back in our seats at 10:30.